Hey everybody, before we get started, a word from our friends at Virginia Theological Seminary. Clarify your focus, sharpen your skills, intensify your ministry with a Doctor of Ministry from VTS. As the largest Episcopal seminary in the United States, VTS offers an unparalleled, flexible DMin program that will introduce you to the latest in congregational development and educational research. You can check them out at vts.edu or on Facebook. Okay, here's your program. Hi everybody, I'm Chris Yaw. Welcome to ChurchNext. It's a place, as you know, where people who are passionate about the local church come to hear from experienced mentors. And today we're joined by a man who's usually on the other side of the microphone, Ken Myers, the voice behind a very popular audio enterprise called the Mars Hill Audio Journal, which publishes in-depth interviews with theologians, with academics, writers, musicians, and deep thinkers who share their learnings on a variety of fascinating subjects. If you don't have a subscription, you need to get one. Ken is an avid reader, a deep thinker, who honed his skills at National Public Radio before undertaking the Mars Hill venture, where he's had much success. And Ken, so great to talk with you after listening to you in my car for years and years and years. Welcome to ChurchNext, and let's start right there. For those, the uninitiated, could you tell us what is the Mars Hill Audio Journal?
Yeah, the journal grew out of my experience. As you mentioned, for 8 years I worked at NPR, and then I worked actually for a few years at an evangelical monthly magazine called Eternity Magazine. And while I was there, it was quite different trying to edit a Christian periodical. I'd been a Christian working at a very un-Christian place at NPR, and trying to figure out what does it mean to edit this and what should our editorial goals be. And while I was there, I thought a lot about the church's cultural captivity. I actually read James Davison Hunter's first book. James is a sociologist who probably was best known for his book Culture Wars, and then most recently a book that he wrote on To Change the World, which a lot of Christians have been reading. But James's dissertation and first book was actually on American evangelicals and the quandary of modernity was the subtitle. And he talked a lot about cultural captivity. He didn't use the word captivity, he used the word accommodation or assimilation, I think, more sociological.
Yeah.
But I began to think a lot about how a lot of the problems that churches have, or a lot of problems that churches have that they don't even recognize that they have, are because of the fact that they're much more caught up in cultural trends, some of them very long-standing trends, and some of them kind of flash-in-the-pan sorts of trends. And so I tried to move the magazine. They told me, we want you to move the magazine in a different direction, and I started moving the magazine toward, first of all, more cultural alertness, paying attention to what's going on in the culture, and then secondly, discerning in light of what's going on whether the church should adopt or resist or moderate or what it should do. The people in charge of the magazine didn't like what I was doing. It didn't seem devotional enough. There weren't enough Bible verses, I was told. And so I left and spent the next 7 years trying to figure out how to put that concern into some kind of journalism, some kind of periodical, and launched Mars Hill Audio in 1992, actually did the first issue 20 years ago this summer. And the goal is, again, our mission statement talks about encouraging wise obedience about the cultural consequences of the duty to love God and neighbor. And so that's a way of summarizing where I think our posture toward culture should start. We live out cultural lives that honor God, and we live cultural lives that will show love to our neighbors. And we need to do that wisely. And so I interview, as you know, lots and lots of people who have written books that either survey the theology of certain aspects of culture on one hand, or they survey what's actually happened in our culture, some of them looking at a horizon back, 200, 300 years. And again, the goal is to try to encourage people to, rather than behaving conventionally or behaving in a kind of predictable way, to take a step back and say, in what ways are our lives more American than Christian, might be a way of putting it.
You remind me, when I lived in England for a little while, one of the things that became, that I noticed was that in America we talk about what's on TV, and in England they actually talk about TV.
Yeah. And talk about TV. What do you mean in terms of
the cultural force of the bigger idea
Yeah, and that's, I wrote a book 20-some years ago called All God's Children in Blue Suede Shoes. And that same thing, I was asked to write a book about popular culture, and I decided, well, let's actually look at popular culture rather than trying to figure out, okay, how can we exploit what's going on? How can we get our message embedded in a system that's already there? I wanted to take a look at the system and say, well, what kinds of things do the system itself convey before any content is actually even there? And that's, my background is in media studies. I actually have a degree in communication, focusing on film and film production and television. But I did work in television and radio, so I've been interested all my adult life in how media function to convey things apart from the content, how the form actually does things. And so, in a sense, the work I've done the last 20 years is not just the forms of media, but the forms of economic structures, the forms of political structures, the forms of other technologies, the forms of social interaction. All of these things carry implicit meaning and kind of nudge us in one direction or another. And I think, again, the task of pastoring, if the task of pastoring is making disciples, Jesus says, teaching them to observe everything I've commanded you, which is pretty comprehensive, then I think that good pastors have to be really discerning about the ways the souls of their congregation are being shaped by other things, Monday through Saturday.
And you carry this caution with you, Ken. I mean, I've noticed from listening to you over the years that you always seem to call it back to a level, to a more foundational level of what is this really causing us to do? How are we being shaped by this certain venue? And as I watch your ministry moving from moving into this digital age, you do so by putting on some brakes. I mean, you do question in a way, the direction we're going by this technology. Could you share your concerns about how the church moves into this digital world?
Well, that gives me a chance to introduce one of the big themes that I think animates the work I've done for 20 years. And, when I started thinking about this more deliberately, by the way, I've learned a lot in 20 years, which I'm glad to say. I'm not saying the same thing I said 20 years ago. And early on, as I began to think about it, I began to realize that one of the characteristics of modern culture generally, and a characteristic that is reinforced by various technologies, is a diminishment of the significance of embodiment. Modern culture emphasizes our identity as minds and wills, and bodies happen to be something that we kind of have to deal with one way or another. And actually, many people kind of wish we could figure out a way to upload our consciousness to a computer and just kind of escape embodiment altogether. So embodiment is, in a sense, a problem for most of modern culture. And so a lot of technologies that we have are a way of diminishing the problem that embodiment is. Well, I mean, the first heresies in the church were heresies that regarded the body as a problem. So they denied that God could take human form. The church is very emphatic, as are the scriptures, in saying he became flesh and dwelt among us. And so the church from the beginning was resisting the Greco-Roman cultural temptation to treat the body as a problem. Now, a lot of our technologies, again, detach us from embodied experience. So while they may have great benefits, I think we also need to look at the liabilities. I interviewed a woman last year, Felicia Song Wu, who's a sociologist who has a background in communications, who's done some really interesting work on social networking and the church. And I was talking to her before the interview, and she said, I just read C.S. Lewis's The Four Loves, and he looks at 4 different kinds of love, the final one being agape, Christian love, and all of its fullness. And she said, I think that social technology, social media can help us with the first three, but I'm just not sure it can actually encourage agape. I think you have to have physical presence with someone to really love them that way. So I guess I'd say, you know, I mean, a general rule of thumb would be, sure, there are all kinds of assets that all sorts of technologies deliver, but look at the balance sheet carefully and say, well, what are the liabilities? What gets lost when you do this? I bought an iPod like the first day they were available, and I have my iPad. I bought an iPad the first day they were available. So I'm not a Luddite, and yet I want to say, okay, well, what does this undo in my life? I found that with the iPod, I was converting all my CDs to MP3 files and taking them with me, but then it turned out I'm not hearing all of the great oral possibilities. Here I got this stereo system at home with really good speakers, and I'm not listening to it. And so I'm detaching myself. I'm gaining convenience, but I'm losing something else. And I'd say that's a general rule of thumb. And churches really need to not just ask themselves this as leaders and planners, but they need to encourage a kind of discernment in the lives of their congregation, so that people aren't just kind of swept along. It's not a wind of doctrine. It's a wind of a possibility that the technologies enable.
Yeah, and technology is just one aspect that we could pursue. Ken, in our pre-interview, we talked a little bit about the larger scope of the consumeristic culture we live in, and what framework does that lay for us when we look at success in light of the church.
Yeah,
and how that's dictated, and you've got some strong thoughts there.
Yeah, well, again, I think that we want to make sure that we take our models from good places, our models of whether or not we're being faithful. Somebody who I think has thought as much about this as anybody, and probably more than most, is Eugene Peterson, and the many books he's written. And he was a pastor for many years, and he realizes. In fact, during one of my interviews with him, he said every young pastor, if he does something that really seems successful, the first thing he has to ask himself is, "What am I doing wrong?" which I think is great. Because he says if it's successful, it's likely to be aligned with something in the culture around it. Mm-hmm. And so we have to ask, well, maybe I feel really successful, but maybe I shouldn't be that successful. And that's a heresy. That's an American heresy to say that. We talked a little bit about the preoccupation with numerical growth before we got started. And again, there are reasons. There's a history to that kind of preoccupation, and it's a history of where the church sees itself more as the provider of a commodity or of a service, but rather than as the nurturer of individuals and the nurturer of communities. Eugene Peterson also says he tells seminary students to read the works of Wendell Berry, who's written a lot about agrarian concerns and healthy farming practices, and he tells seminarians every time you see the word farm, substitute the word church, and you'll get a lot of wisdom out of it. And it turns out that scale is important, that bigger isn't always better in actually building disciples. One of the other things that I think, and this is something I've been concerned about for some time, and actually done a little bit of writing about, and that is most Americans have a sense of identity as a consumer. They see themselves, first of all, as consumers, as sovereign choosers, as people who the customer is always right, who understand their whole identity in terms of pursuing their own preferences. Identity as a consumer and identity as a disciple are very, very different things. And a lot of what it seems to me discipleship and conversion should be about is moving people from seeing themselves as consumers as a principal identity, even though they may not ever articulate that, to having a sense of being a disciple, of being someone who seeks to move in directions that might sometimes involve sacrifice, that might sometimes, will inevitably involve sacrifice.
I think that was a promise.
Yeah, exactly. Will inevitably involve, denying yourself. Consumers aren't supposed to be put in positions. My kids both worked in retail right after they got out of college, and consumers are never supposed to be put in a position where they have to deny themselves, and yet that's the first thing a disciple has to achieve. So, and again, part of the problem is a lot of clergy have to face up to the fact that most people who walk in the door probably do think of themselves as consumers and are probably going to treat them and the church as just as a provider of goods and services. So it's really it's very, very difficult to move people away from that, because it does require a deeper conversion than I think we often assume needs to be affected.
Well, you're describing the water in which we swim, Ken, and how does the church become this in the world yet not of the world? And speak to, frankly, with the transition that we're going through now as a church, as a country, et cetera, it causes so much fear. And people run to what they feel is secure. And when you bring up ideas that have to do with self-sacrifice and denial, that frequently doesn't get more people in the church. And so therefore you feel like you're not successful. I'm curious, Ken, if as you survey the church from your point of view, were you in seminary? What would you teach your pastors going out? What would you offer as advice to them?
I think the first thing is that I teach them to try to, I teach them to try to move people from seeing themselves first as Americans who happen to be Christians, and rather see themselves as Christians, as disciples of Jesus Christ who happen to be Americans. And that when we were raising our kids, we thought a lot about this, about how when they use the first person plural pronoun, when they say we, who might they have in mind when they say we? And if what they mean is our family or our people, that's a good thing. If what they mean is my age group or my socioeconomic class or my nationality, that's a little bit more problematic. Now, sometimes, obviously, we do speak that way, and that's where our sense of membership is. But to really cultivate a sense of membership, of belonging, and that means that that local churches have to be more than just spiritual filling stations. I was at a church several years ago, and I was there on a Sunday where they were honoring the clergy. They had a series of Sundays before Stewardship Sunday where they were honoring people in various people on the church staff, and I happened to be there when they honored the clergy, and the fellow who came up to honor the clergyman started talking about how important it was to be in a community where you could rely on people, and he started talking about Mayberry, and he started talking about how Gomer Pyle was always available, and he basically started describing the clergy as if they were kind of the guy at the filling station, and they actually handed a ceremonial squeegee and bottle spray bottle to the rector of the church, thinking this was a way of honoring him for being kind of like Gomer Pyle. And I thought, and the rector was not entirely happy, but he was very gracious about it. I've talked to pastors. I talked to one pastor who said he was a Presbyterian. He said, my session treats me like I'm their pool boy. Again, this is part of the problem with the consumer culture. Now, but if people just kind of come on Sunday and get recharged and then go away, there's a certain sense in which, that's of course how they're going to regard you. They're going to have a kind of drive-through experience, effectively. So I think you have to figure out, well, how can you magnify or amplify the kinds of interactions among members of a congregation throughout the week, so that the church isn't just the spiritual filling station, and that they do have a sense of membership with one another, as well as membership in the church universal throughout time. I think that idea of membership is the first thing I would really strongly emphasize. Secondly, I would, again, just encourage them to have the courage to be discerning, because it does require a lot of courage. I think that there's a sense in which for the last 250 years, American churches have served as a kind of chaplaincy to the American way of life. And so, but the American way of life, for a variety of reasons, is becoming more and more problematic from a Christian standpoint. And a lot of people have that sense that that's the case. So to figure out how can the church be a community where a way of life is pursued together, rather than accepting the menu options that happen to be dished up by Wall Street or by advertising or by Hollywood or whoever. And again, to do this in pretty deep ways, not just superficial and cosmetic ways. It's a huge, huge challenge because it means a total paradigm shift both for clergy and for the laity, some of whom, well, many of whom are going to not be happy with that kind of paradigm shift. They're not coming. Many lay people are not coming to church to have their lives radically rearranged. They're coming to church for some cosmetic, touch-ups, a little fine tuning, and yet they may well probably need more than fine tuning.
Right. And I often wonder, Ken, how do we build a sense of expectancy in a culture that has always been, has been 90% believe in God, 80% are Christians, yet it's an inch deep.
Right. Well, again, I don't think you do it just, I know some people think you just need to give longer sermons. That's not the solution. So I think, and this is one of the things that I think is encouraging, that a lot of more and more people realize the importance of what are called practices, of activities that involve embodied activity, involve an attention to how we situate our experience in space and time, as a way of spiritual formation. And so I would say, the promotion of practices and within the life of the church, and this can take a really simple form. I know one church, for instance, where the pastor and his wife used to invite several couples or families to their home every Sunday after church, for a meal. This was a huge obligation. This meant a lot of work. And they soon realized that other people started doing this. And so on any given Sunday now in that congregation, the whole congregation is at maybe 10 different houses after church, 20, 25 people in a house. And they spend much of Sunday afternoon together in kind of rotating groups. And it's not, from what I gather, not just little cliques that like each other. And and so when you visit, I knew someone who was visiting this church, and the next 5 weeks they had dinner engagements after their first visit. And now again, that's, Americans like their privacy. That's a little bit, and yet it turns out that the practicing of hospitality, even though at some level we like our privacy, we don't like that kind of commitment. At a deeper level, we're created for community. We're created for love. We're created for things like sharing meals. And it turns out that the kind of way of life that's very different from the American way of life actually fits human nature much, much better than the conventional way of an American way of life. And so I think we need a confidence. I was just reading something this morning on theological anthropology and understanding of human nature. And I think that's probably the doctrinal area where we need to focus so much attention, that and the doctrine of creation. What does it mean to be human? Famously in the parable, before Jesus tells the story of the Good Samaritan, he talks about loving your neighbor, and he's asked, who is my neighbor? We need to ask, what is my neighbor? What kind of being is my neighbor? What kind of what is at the heart of their existence? And that's where I think, because we're created in the image of a loving triune God, that we have to be confident that love is somehow at the center of their existence, and that love that actually takes very specific forms is at the center of their existence. So we have to, in a sense, have a higher view of them than they do of themselves. And I think that that does have, obviously there's a lot of cultural resistance to those things, but it can break through, and I've seen it break through in people's lives when they're treated as the kind of creature that they really are.
Yeah, I mean, the more you describe it and unpack it, the instruction manual, the creator would know how to fulfill what's been created better than we who see through a glass dimly and try to blow all sorts of things out of proportion. Ken, one of the things that I really admire about your work, and that's been very nurturing to me, and I do when I get your CDs now, they're in there for a while. Because you've got to listen to them more than once.
Well, that was a very deliberate decision. I worked for years in radio, and radio is like ephemeral. Radio's there and it's gone.
Yeah.
And I remember Noah Adams, who was the host of All Things Considered for a while. He had a little sign on the wall above his edit booth that says, "It's only a radio program. It's going to be over and it'll be gone." When I started this, I thought, I'm asking people to pay. It was originally on cassette tape.
Oh, right? I've still got them.
Yeah, so I thought, okay, after a year, I'm going to ask them to renew. If they didn't listen more than once, if they felt this was disposable, they're probably not going to renew. So it was a very mercenary marketing decision to try to force people to actually experience the thing more than once. But also, the people I'm talking to have an awful lot.
Right. And I mean, the judicious use of words certainly that you use and your guests use. And my question is the importance of bringing the informed mind into what we do. That's one of the challenges with the technology that faces us, and with the water that we swim in. It goes by so fast, and yet you seem to put up a warning flag there, saying, "Look, it's the informed life."
Yeah, and so I was fortunate when I was a young man in college. I read some books on contemplative prayer, and I read some books because I was interested in learning how to pray better. And it turned out that it wasn't just a set of quick tips on techniques for prayer. That it had to do with a kind of orientation of one's time, and you had to be patient and you had to be attentive. Here I was working in media. I was working in mass media, in my late teens. I'm working with technologies that work in the direction toward distraction rather than attentiveness. I remember thinking, wouldn't it be neat if on a newscast some night, if a newscaster said, "This is a really important story. Turn off your set for 5 minutes and think about this." You can't do that. You can't do that. Dead air is everybody's nightmare, right? Yes, we could sell that time. So a little insider broadcasting thing. Again, the technologies make possible all sorts of wonderful things if we're using them thoughtfully.
Right.
I early on in producing the journal, I thought that what I'm really trying to encourage is a kind of deliberateness.
Yeah.
And that's not, I mean, in a way that's a lot to ask, because there are so many pressures that encourage us to behave instinctually and not deliberately. And yet, even a really quick reading of the New Testament should suggest that a kind of deliberateness is necessary for discipleship. And I think that ought to be one of the things. During the early church, when people saw congregations of Christians, they saw something that looked different from the Greco-Roman norm. Yeah. They saw something that was odd, and they asked questions about it because of the odd thing. And so if our congregations were places where people on the whole were more likely to be deliberate, or more likely to not feel uncomfortable with slowing down now and then, who didn't get fidgety when they had to turn off their cell phones, that would be a remarkable, and again, a remarkably humanizing thing for those who have ears to hear, eyes to see. That we could be seen as people who have actually not truncated lives, not lives that are shortened or but actually lives that that are actually much richer.
What do you think we need to bring into our churches in terms of practices to help us be the subversive people we're supposed to be?
Well, I mean, I usually, when people say, how do you think churches should be countercultural, I have a short list of things that I usually start with, and they're not directly focused on technology, but I do say that churches should be places where language is respected, and where we're attentive to how we use language. That language is this amazing gift of God, and often we use language in a careless way. And so I think that, you know, churches should be communities where we can take delight in the capacities of language, and this starts with the liturgy, but it can spread down. You know, when our kids were younger, we exposed them to lots of good writing and encouraged them to read poetry. I mean, who reads poetry anymore? Turns out a lot of the Bible is in poetry, and so not to be able to feel how poetry communicates through metaphor and through likenesses, I think puts us at a great disadvantage.
Isn't our humanity going to bring us back, though? I mean, you know.
That's my hope, is that finally the givenness of our human nature always testifies to whatever distortions any culture happens to dish out. And so, again, if you see this, you see human nature breaking out every now and then in all kinds of places. And so, but I think the church ought to be a community rather than trying to imitate the distortions to our nature, which and hence being a recognizable entity. And I can understand that temptation. But rather than doing that, we need to have the courage to kind of lean into the wind, lean into the prevailing wind, and really be transformed by the renewing of our minds, as Paul says we have to be. So language, the second one I always talk about is meals together. I actually, when I was at Eternity magazine in 1984, I for the first time saw someone had sent us a report that had been produced by a church marketing firm that was that had been hired to produce a kind of church planting prospectus for some folks in Northern California. And I had never seen anything like this before. It was actually kind of a new idea at the time. And one of the pieces of advice that struck me really badly was these people are too busy to share meals together. So don't have any church suppers, because they're just too busy for that. And if you do, have them catered, because they're never going to cook. They're never going to cook for one another. And my feeling was, well, that's if their lives are such that they never have meals together, then part of what the church needs to do is to resist that by actually having meals together.
That becomes subversive and countercultural.
Yeah, but it actually becomes quite delightful, and it becomes again a possibility for some aspect of their humanity which had been obscured to actually be to emerge.
Yeah, and you read best practices for parenting, and it's something like if you have 5 meals a week together, the divorce rate goes way down. I mean, there are all kinds of things that
absolutely. Yeah, there's so much statistical data that this is such a good thing,
and a simple thing.
So you can actually measure this, which not everything you can. So, and then the third thing I always say is that churches should be intergenerational communities. So we shouldn't segregate generations. I really think that the 20th century invention of youth culture is a really destructive thing, and it's kind of an institutionalization of the breaking of the fifth commandment. It's a way, the fifth commandment isn't just about obeying your parents. I think the fifth commandment, in its richest sense, is about the delight of the possibility of intergenerational continuity, that people can delight in their children and their children's children, and the children and their children can delight in their parents and grandparents. And so that picture of intergenerational harmony, which has been a problem since day two. So I'm not saying this is easy, but it is the ideal for which we're created, I think, to see that. So for the church to have, and I'm waiting for some bright young church historian, PhD candidate, to write a book on why the church endorsed this generational apartheid so early on, given the fact that it just seems like an odd way to raise kids, just on the face of it, to kind of turn them over to advertisers. So, and I know a lot of churches are doing this. A lot of churches are. I interviewed somebody years ago who started a ministry called Family-Based Youth Ministries, Mark DeVries, and he says we don't have youth directors, we have family ministry directors who teach parents how to nurture their kids, but who basically say the whole congregation is an extended family. Every kid is being raised by every adult in this congregation, and so to rearrange the church's expectations so that communities have that kind of capacity. Now, if that's the case, then a lot of the other things that are a lot of the vulnerabilities that are exploited by various technologies or technical systems aren't as big an issue. If that happens. So I look for, again, rather than focusing on disorders that might be introduced by the technologies, let's say, well, where are the sites of order? What kinds of goods do we want to pursue, and then what would it take to achieve those goods?
Well, this last point that you make, Ken, on intergenerational worship and intergenerational, I mean, the church is really the last bastion for a number of really important, I think, formative practices. Music being another one. You hardly hear people sing anymore.
Right.
And certainly the idea of in our daily lives in America, you take the kid to the child care place, and is what you're alluding to, where churches were really meant to be places where there's a higher good.
Right. And so we have a different understanding of what children are. We have a different understanding of what family is. We have a different understanding of again, the continuity of a people in time as a good thing, and not just an obstacle to progress or an obstacle to making money or whatever it might be. So it should be expected, since we have a different understanding of these things, that our practices will begin to look different. I think part of the problem we face is there's been an over-rationalistic tendency in the church to say, well, all that's necessary is we have the right worldview or the right views on things. Now, I'm not uninterested in intellectual pursuits, obviously, but the whole point is to understand these things so that we can live accordingly. It's not enough to have a good view about things and then pursue a way of life that actually undermines or contradicts the very thing that we've just articulated. And I think that's why, again, we're used to living in the conventional American way, and then we just add a message on Sundays that might be like a warning label to the American way of something, rather than figuring out how do we have a way of life that really lives out, that is a kind of I think there's a passage in Titus that talks about our lives being a kind of ornament or adornment to the truth. Titus 2 is one of my favorite biblical texts, because he talks about dispositions and practices that are in accord with sound doctrine. He doesn't tell Titus just teach sound doctrine. He says teach a way of life that really is, and by modeling it in your own life, that really is in accord with the truth.
And you're talking to a lot of to Christian leaders who tend to be my viewers, Ken, who are probably somewhat surprised with or taken aback with what you're saying in terms of a radical reorientation, not simply in the Christian's life, but in the leadership of Christianity as we know it. So how do we start to get a wider view? How do we what practices and do we take part in? I get listening and being attentive come to mind. Deliberateness. What else?
Well, I think to understand. Well, again, I usually assume having just said that that intellectual life isn't all, I do think that we do have to kind of correct our thinking about things. So I do think that we have to understand that the way we view, well, C.S. Lewis in one of his essays, I think it was in On Learning in Wartime, talked about it was important to have knowledge of the past, so that the conventions of our present time don't beguile us, and so we're not constricted. He said if we could study the future, that would be perfectly good. It's not that the past was always right, but we can't study the future.
The book hasn't been written yet.
Yeah, right. So let's look at the past so that we can remind ourselves that the things we regard as kind of givens actually may be historically situated, and so I'd say you know, and this is one of the things I'm very happy that Protestants in particular, who didn't always have this, in the last 20 or 30 years, there's been much more concern with the practices of the early church, so that rather than just saying, okay, here's Paul's letter to Galatians, how can we live this out? A lot more people are saying, here's how Chrysostom or Augustine understood how to live out Paul's letter to Galatians, or here's how the church did this in the 12th century. How, you know, what might we learn from that? So I think just that kind of cultivating that kind of historical consciousness, where we actually get some fresh insights by believers from other settings, who are wrestling with the same text that we are. So I think that's the first thing. I think that the practice of silence is something underappreciated too, and that's related to the whole issue of attentiveness. Having times when we're not talking or listening or watching or texting or whatever.
Because silence isn't just listening. I mean,
no.
You know.
Oh no. It's actually can be a very rich kind of thing. Joseph Pieper in his book Leisure: The Basis of Culture has some wonderful insights about the possibilities of silence, and how silence really is a necessary part of civilization, he argues. Again, because of the capacity to kind of discover our own identity in reflection. In terms of other practices, you know, I already mentioned meals. I don't have I don't have another list. I think I think that conversation is actually I did an interview. You know, my life is about conversations with people. Right. Conversation is kind of a lost art. Getting together with people without an agenda or without a to-do list, and being able to converse for 2 or 3 or 4 hours without watching something together, that's actually a lost art also. And I think it's a practice that has, again, remarkable capacity both for how we regard language, how we love one another, how we I think we're built, we're constructed, we're created in order to find reality and to find our identity in conversation. Pieper, again, in one of his other essays, says that the natural habitat of truth is human conversation. And I was kind of disappointed because I thought it was all books. I've got 12,000 books in my library. I thought that's where the truth lives. But it turns out it lives in conversation.
Well, if you haven't found it yet.
No, I keep digging for it. But it turns out, because it's dynamic, it's personal, and it's personal. Truth is really is personal. Yeah. So I'd say, that would be another good practice that again is in a way countercultural. One of the things that a lot of researchers have discovered about texting technologies is, you know, and it's not uncommon for people sitting in the same room across the room from each other to be texting. College campuses are famous for this, and not because they want to do it subversively or covertly, but because of the fact that people feel uncomfortable making eye contact. They feel uncomfortable in the awkwardness, and they feel uncomfortable not being able to control the off switch. Because when you're face to face with someone in conversation, you can't just turn it off easily. And so all sorts of, a lot of our communications technologies are designed to give us total control over communication, which doesn't just mean the capacity to initiate, but the capacity to end a conversation when we want to, or when the computer freezes up, as happened to us.
But boy, I'm trying to think, Ken, to what degree I've even been in extended conversations, and to what delight that has been.
Oh, yeah.
I think with my wife and I, we just to be away with no radio, and it's amazing. It takes you a little while to get into it, because it's kind of this world you haven't been to in a while. And then when you get there, you think, how did I ever stay quiet for so long?
Right. And then it turns out that almost every other experience you have is interrelated with that capacity for conversation. I was speaking to a group of college students a couple of years ago about the decline of reading in American culture, and one of the students said, "Well, what if you're more of a people person?" And I said, "Well, then what would you talk about if you're not reading any books?" Some of the best conversations I've had have been about books, and reading a book is a kind of conversation.
Yeah, that's exactly what I was going to say. Yeah, it's just a conversation where it's more one way than you'd like it.
Right, but then I think it's quite natural to, and that's why I think there are book groups all over the country, and we can thank Oprah for some of that. But it's built into our nature to have that kind of the Father, Son, and the Spirit converse. There's communication between the members of the Trinity, and so that's built into our nature. And for it not to be there, and for it not to be mutually supportive, or for one party to want to have control over the conversation, is something that again is contrary to the Trinitarian model that's behind this.
Well, Ken, our time is up, and the conversation could go on. I want to thank you so much for joining me on Church Next.
Thank you.